I want to start off talking to you about some misconceptions that every educated person, or nearly every educated person, has about language. I want to show you how terribly important language is, and I want to show you that language is just not a series of words strung together. And this business about the misconception about language and words, probably the most important one is this conviction that so many of us have, that words have meaning, that every word has or should have one unalterable and unchanging meaning. Well, this is just not so. As we're going to see, words never have just one meaning ever. So the opposite of theoretical is practical, and practical is obviously on this side. And again, a word like research. I asked an American just the other day, what's the opposite of research? Research's opposite is production, without a question. In other words, I wonder then how we think about those people who are concerned in research, theoretical matters. I think we're probably of two minds about them, which might explain a lot of newspaper headlines we have today. Now, do all languages work like this? No. Chinese, for instance, doesn't. Chinese has a word, hao, which we translate good. But if you should ask a Chinese gentleman, if you met him on the street, Xiancheng hao, if you said that to him, it would mean honored one, firstborn person, are things good with you? His answer would be hao. But does hao really mean good, right, moral, innocent? No, it means for the shape I'm in I should complain. And if he should answer you bu hao, which we would translate bad, would it mean things are bad? No, it means for the shape I'm in I shouldn't complain. But since you asked me just this once, I'll tell you, though I know things have been like this for 2,000 years in the past and will be like this for 2,000 years in the future. In other words, what it means is that we really can't translate the Chinese word into English, nor can English words be translated in this regard into Chinese. And that may be one of the reasons why we're having difficulty with the Chinese right now in international relations. So what I've been doing for the first half of this program is to be talking to you about words. And I've tried to show you that words can get us into trouble, that words themselves are not language, and that words themselves don't do the whole job. If words then, if language is more than words, what makes words operate? Well, words operate in language because language is pattern. And the thing that makes words work are patterns. That is what does the job. And this whole magnificent, amazing business of patterning, from the smallest sounds into words and up through the whole thing, that's what we're going to be talking about on this series of programs. Now, to show you how words can operate through patterns, let me show you something here. Let's take a word and pull it right out of pattern, right out of language. Toes. Now, you will say, obviously, that word doesn't mean anything. Well, let me show you how, if we put it back into pattern, we can get it to do some work for us. We can see that it can get meaning. Now, here it is. Now, notice. This is, of course, Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, which I've loved for years, and I've always said it this way, and I'm going to read it for you now. I don't know how you perhaps said it, but I've said, "'Twas brillig in the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave, all mimsy were the bora groves and the mome raths outgrave." Right away now, I know, having this in pattern, that toves are more than one here, that slithy toves are obviously toves that are slippery and slimy, and that toes can gyre and gimble and where better but in the wave, a very natural place for them to gyre and gimble. And brillig obviously refers to a time of day or condition of the atmosphere where it's particularly appropriate for slithy toes to do their gyre and gimbling in the wave. I have actually given it, then, meaning. I have given this word toves meaning and several other words because it has been put into patterns, grammatical patterns as we call them, and distributional patterns. This whole business of patterning, only man has been able to actually invent language. We'll think a moment about grammatical patterns, for instance. Now, here is the grammatical pattern, the favored sentence type of a language like English, the actor, action, result sentence type, the subject, verb, and complement we all learned about in school. This kind of pattern, along with the fact that the verb must be put along a timeline, past, non-past, or present and future. This pattern allows words to work for us, allows us to talk about the world of experience. For instance, we can say, I went to Paris. Mr. Jones went to Paris. But we also have to say, the road went to Paris, when we know perfectly well that roads don't get up and go anywhere, and nobody takes them anywhere. So obviously, then, these kinds of grammatical patterns, which are obligatory, are straitjackets on us, allow us to talk, allow the words to work for us. But at times, because the pattern is obligatory, sometimes we put words into the slot and begin to react to them as though they were alive. For instance, because what I'm going to do now is, and what I've been doing, is just giving you a very brief survey of patterns. I'd like to show you now, if I could, another pattern. what we call the intonation pattern. In other words, we've talked very briefly about grammatical patterns, about distributional patterns. Now the intonation pattern is composed of pitches of the voice, shown here by numbers, and ways in which we end stretches of utterance, shown here by the single bar mark, which squeezes the pitch, this one here, which allows the voice to trail off into silence, and this one here, which represents the voice rising. Now these particular numbers I can now read because they are a clue to which significant pitch level is used. Now listen, he has a very pleasant personality. When I keep it up at pitch 2, 1 is the lowest and 4 is the highest pitch, and let it trail off into silence, I have now said the only thing this person has to recommend him is a sort of speciousness of personality. Now, if I say it this way, he has a very pleasant personality, and allow my voice to rise slightly there. He has a very pleasant personality. You hear that? That means now we would expect, but I don't like the way he parts his hair, I don't like the way he talks to his wife at the bridge table. Now if I say he has a very pleasant personality, come all the way down to pitch 1 and go off into silence, I've made a compliment, made a complimentary statement in our culture. In other words, same distribution patterns, same grammatical patterns, but different intonation patterns. Gives me 3 entirely different meanings, and yet there's only one little piece of structure different in each one of these cases. In other words, patterns. Patterns are the things that do the job for us. Now, this business of patterning, this extremely important business of patterning, and I've just given you some very rapidly some examples. We've mentioned distributional, grammatical patterns, now intonation patterns. But I want you to realize this, that this very quick survey of patterning, which is what we're going to be doing on this series of programs, that language itself, this amazing system of patterning, which is only the possession of human beings, language itself is not the only kind of pattern system that goes on in communication. That is communication now, meaning how people really interact with each other. Obviously, language is the principal mode of communicating, of interacting. But there are other things that go on, other patterns that are patterned in of themselves and patterned with language. Paralanguage, tone of voice phenomena over and above language. And kinesics. Kinesics, the structured and patterned use of bodily motion in communication. Now what we have to realize is this. We can actually not talk at all. That is, language can never be used for any appreciable length without paralanguage and kinesics at the same time. In other words, if you listen to me now, as you have been, you've heard my voice go up and down. You've heard, for instance, that particular over loudness that I used just then for emphasis. That kind of thing is part of paralanguage, what we call over loudness, and it can be measured in degrees and seen to pattern. I can also go over soft, and that can be used for emphasis too. And notice, as I'm talking, notice how my knees went down and my finger came out. I can't possibly talk without both paralanguage and kinesics. For instance, take kinesics for just a second. If I want to be sure you're listening to me, I can say something like this. Do you understand me? Do you really understand me? And you will notice that my head goes down. I'm digging you, so to speak. My eyebrows wrinkle and my eyelids blink up and down. I can't possibly speak a sentence, certain kinds of sentences, without a kinesic marker. For instance, just a simple sentence like this one. Suppose I wanted to say to you something like this. John gave Bill money. Did you notice what I did with my head? John gave Bill money. Did you see my head go over there on money? I've got to give a signal with my body when I get to that particular word. I've got John gave Bill money. If it's not my head, it's going to be my thumb or some part of my body. John gave Bill money. Head can go on that side. But I have to use part of this other patterning along with language in order to really talk. Again, paralanguage, all kinds of things can happen here, and we know what they are. We know how to structure them. Let me give you an example we call the vocal characterizer of breaking of the voice. For instance, if I say, yeah, I suppose so. Now this nervous giggle obviously signals that I'm not quite secure in what I'm saying. If I use, for instance, that breaking in another context, and as I lay down my burden to those younger and stronger than I, there's a politician, and that breaking is supposed to give you an idea of how emotionally he's involved in what he's saying. Now, when all of these things fit together, they are what we call congruent. In other words, when paralanguage and when language and when kinesics all pattern together in an expected way, then communication goes on with relatively little disturbance. In other words, if I should see you in the morning, I should say, how are you this morning? With a smile like that, and that kind of kinesics, that's congruent. But if I should say, how are you this morning? With that kind of paralanguage and that kind of kinesics, that's not congruent. Now, the whole business of checking congruence and incongruence has actually allowed us to see, since we can symbolize this business now, has actually allowed us to see what really goes on in communication. And this is being used now to help people understand what goes on in the psychotherapeutic interview. Linguists and kinesiologists are now helping psychiatrists really evaluate the psychotherapeutic interview. Now, in our 13th program, we're actually going to go into that particular aspect of communication. But what we're going to do now is to not concern ourselves with paralanguage and kinesics until, again, the 13th program, but with language. In other words, it is the patterning of language, and what language is and what it isn't, which is our principal concern on this program. Now, to summarize for you what we have done today, we have been, of course, extremely rapid. And I have had to go very, very rapidly over a very vast subject. But I have tried to, even at the very beginning, talk about certain misconceptions that people have. And the primary misconception that we've been talking about is that language is more than words, and that words themselves do not have one unalterable and unchanging meaning. That the thing that makes words do their work for us is actually the patterns of language, and that the patterns of language are of varying kinds, and that we can now analyze these patterns and we can actually see the structure of language. Now, it's